In the neuron organization, the autonomic nervous system, remember, autonomic nerve pathways consist of two neurons in series. We have a preganglionic and a postganglionic. The first neuron, of course, is a preganglionic. Its cell body is located within the central nervous system, and its axon innervates the cell body of the second neuron within this autonomic ganglia. The second neuron is a postganglionic neuron. Its cell body is in the autonomic ganglion here, and its axon innervates a target tissue. So this neuron organization that we're going to be going over, the worded form, is basically describing what we saw in the table. In the parasympathetic division, the cell bodies of preganglionic neurons are in the brain and sacral segments. They're coming out of this cranial area and they're coming out of the sacral area for the parasympathetic nervous system. We call this the cranial sacral outflow because of where it's coming out of the spinal cord. Preganglionics of the parasympathetic nervous system generally have really long fibers that synapse with a ganglion that lie in or very near that effector organ. They have very short postganglionic fibers that innervate that organ. When you look at the parasympathetic nervous system, the preganglionic neurons release acetylcholine as their neurotransmitter, and it's going to activate those nicotinic receptors on that postganglionic neuron. So just like we talked about before, an action potential is going to come down the preganglionic. Sodium's going to come in. It's going to raise the membrane potential to activate voltage-gated calcium channels. Calcium comes in, stimulates the release of vesicles containing acetylcholine. The acetylcholine is going to go across the synaptic cleft and bind to nicotinic acetylcholine receptors on that postganglionic neuron. Acetylcholine esterase breaks down the acetylcholine. That postganglionic neuron, once it gets activated, as shown here, will send its action potential down, stimulate voltage-gated sodium channels to open. Sodium comes in, raises the membrane potential to activate voltage-gated calcium channels. Calcium comes in, stimulates the release of vesicles containing acetylcholine. They go across the synaptic cleft and they bind to muscarinic acetylcholine receptors found on those postsynaptic cells. Now, as you get better and better at naming these receptors, so that you know that muscarinic acetylcholine receptors and nicotinic acetylcholine receptors both bind to acetylcholine, then you can start leaving off the acetylcholine in there. So you just refer to them as muscarinic receptors or nicotinic receptors. Well, these muscarinic receptors that you find on the target tissue, this particular one right here that crosses the membrane 7 times, remember that 7 transmembrane receptor, it's a G protein coupled receptor. And the acetylcholine across is broken down by acetylcholine esterase. When we look at the sympathetic division, the cell bodies of the preganglionic neurons are located within the thoracic and lumbar segments of the spinal cord. So we refer to this as the thoracolumbar outflow. Most of these are going to have relatively short preganglionic fibers, and they synapse with a ganglion that lie in the sympathetic chain or collateral ganglion. So here's a sympathetic chain here, and we'll see that they can either synapse here with a postganglionic neuron and then go out to their various organs, or they can go right through the sympathetic chain ganglion and then synapse in a collateral ganglion, and then their postganglionic fibers will go out and innervate these organs. Since it's coming out of the thoracic area and the lumbar area, we refer to it as a thoracolumbar outflow. Here are some examples of the collateral ganglion. We have the celiac ganglion. We have the superior mesenteric ganglion, the inferior mesenteric ganglion. And if you look at all these, the cell bodies are located within the thoracic area and the lumbar area. In the sympathetic nervous system, we call this the thoracolumbar outflow. And this is going out, it's synapsing with these various postganglionic neurons, and they're innervating those organs. So the preganglionic neurons of the sympathetic nervous system are going to release acetylcholine, just like those preganglionics of the parasympathetic nervous system. They activate nicotinic acetylcholine receptors on the postganglionic neurons. Postganglionic neurons are then going to release norepinephrine. Once those postganglionic neurons are activated, action potential goes down to the end, and everything we talked about before happens here, except that the postganglionic neurons release norepinephrine to activate the receptors on the target cell, which can also be G protein coupled receptors. But they're different receptors. These are specific for norepinephrine, whereas the ones we talked about with the parasympathetic nervous system get activated by acetylcholine. General rules for autonomic nervous system, neurotransmitters and receptors. Both sympathetic and parasympathetic preganglionic neurons are going to release acetylcholine as its neurotransmitter. And that neurotransmitter is going to bind to nicotinic receptors on postganglionic neurons. Most postganglionic sympathetic neurons are going to secrete norepinephrine onto adrenergic receptors, those alpha and beta receptors, on the target cell. And where it says most, that means that in general, yes, they're going to release norepinephrine. However, there are going to be some that don't release norepinephrine, and we'll talk about those in the next video. Most postganglionic parasympathetic neurons are going to secrete acetylcholine onto muscarinic receptors on target cells. Again, since it says most, we're going to see that those postganglionic parasympathetic neurons, there are some exceptions that do not release acetylcholine, and we'll talk about that later on. Let's take a little quiz. In the sympathetic nervous system, what's the point of the central nervous system origin? Where does it come out of the central nervous system? It comes out of the thoracolumbar region. Parasympathetic comes out of cranial sacral region. More specifically, the sympathetic is going to come out between T1 and L2, thoracolumbar. Parasympathetic comes out of the brainstem and the sacral area, S2 to S4. We call that the cranial sacral. In the sympathetic nervous system, the neurotransmitter at the ganglion is acetylcholine. Parasympathetic is also acetylcholine, because we know that all preganglionic, sympathetic, or parasympathetic neurons release acetylcholine as their neurotransmitter at the ganglion. What's the receptor at the ganglion for this acetylcholine on both sympathetic and parasympathetic? Nicotinic. Now, when you look at the sympathetic, the neurotransmitter at the target synapse, so that postganglionic neuron of the sympathetic nervous system, what type of neurotransmitter does it release? In general, we'll see there's some exceptions to this, but it's going to release norepinephrine, whereas parasympathetic is going to release acetylcholine. Type of neurotransmitter receptors at the target synapse. For sympathetic, it's going to be your adrenergic, such as your alpha and beta receptors, and parasympathetic is going to be muscarinic. In the next video, we're going to be going over some of the exceptions in the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system to those general rules that we were talking about.